I'm Elizabeth Miller Liz to the few who bother to use my name. I'm 32, the daughter who grew up as the family's afterthought. And only now do I understand what it means to carry a name that was never meant to protect me. In the Miller household, love was never equal. My brother Chris was the golden child, the heir, the pride, the one whose smallest victory was celebrated like legend. I was the shadow, the fool, the one they laughed at, dismissed, and trained the whole family to treat as less. The moment that shattered everything came years later, not with a raised voice, but with a single vibration on the dining table. A phone call. One name glowing across my screen, and suddenly the laughter that had followed me all my life fell silent. For the first time, the balance tilted toward me. Ever been told you'll never measure up? Hit like if your family ever made you feel small. Comment if someone else always took the spotlight while you faded in the background. For me, it all began long before that call back in the grand dining room of the Miller estate, on the night of my 8th birthday. The birthday cake was nearly as tall as I was. A mountain of sugar and cream balanced precariously on the tray the maid set down before me. The birthday cake was nearly as tall as I was. A mountain of sugar and cream balanced precariously on the tray the maid set down before me. Someone urged me to carry it toward the table, to share it with the guests, and in that instant my hands trembled with the weight. I wanted to impress them. I wanted just once to see my parents smile at me the way they smiled at Chris. My arms shook, the tray tipped, and in front of 24 relatives the cake slid and collapsed onto the polished floor with a thud that echoed louder than the music. A moment of silence, then an explosion of laughter. My aunts clapped their hands to their mouths, uncles slapped their knees, cousins pointed and roared. The sound filled every corner of the dining hall, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Chris stood there, tall and perfect at 11 years old, grinning as though the whole performance had been arranged for him. "Clumsy little Liz," he announced, puffing out his chest. "She can't even hold a cake straight." His words, light and playful on the surface, cut deeper than knives. "Look at her face!" someone shouted. "She's red as the frosting." The laughter grew sharper, rippling outward, feeding on itself. My parents didn't scold him. They didn't defend me. They simply shook their heads as though confirming what everyone already believed, that I was a disappointment, destined to fail even at carrying dessert. And then it came. One cousin, with a smirk too wide for his young face, leaned across the table and christened me with a single word. Fool. The hall erupted again. It wasn't just laughter now, it was the sealing of a label, a curse wrapped in amusement. Fool. 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 The word repeated around the room, bouncing from mouth to mouth, until it felt tattooed onto my skin. Chris laughed louder than anyone, and instead of being corrected, he was praised for his wit. My father clapped him on the shoulder, proud of his quick tongue. My mother chuckled, telling him not to be too cruel, but her voice lacked conviction. To them, it was just a harmless joke. To me, it was a sentence. I bent down, trying to scoop up the ruined cake with trembling hands, sticky frosting clinging to my fingers. Tears burned my eyes, but I forced them back, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Chris leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered, "This is why you'll never be like me. Everyone sees it." His breath smelled of sugar, his tone smug, his confidence absolute. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove him into the mess on the floor. But I froze, too small, too weak, too afraid of making things worse. Around me, relatives resumed their chatter, already moving on, but the sting lingered like fire under my skin. In that moment, I understood the hierarchy of the Miller family. Chris was the golden child, the pride, the perfect heir. I was the fool, the comic relief, destined to be remembered only for my blunders. The party carried on. Music played again, and the servants rushed to replace the ruined cake with pastries from the kitchen. Chris basked in the attention, telling stories about his school victories, his piano recitals, his every accomplishment met with applause. My parents beamed, nodding along while I sat at the end of the table, frosting still under my fingernails, the taste of humiliation bitter on my tongue. Every smile aimed at him felt like another knife. Every dismissive glance toward me carved the word deeper into my heart. It wasn't just a joke, it was permission for everyone to treat me as less, to expect nothing, to laugh when I stumbled. And I understood, even at 8 years old, that once a label sticks, it rarely comes off. As the night drew on and the relatives prepared to leave, I slipped away from the dining hall, seeking refuge in the shadows of the garden. The air was cold, biting against my cheeks, but it cleared the fog of humiliation. Above me, the stars looked distant, unreachable, just like the approval I craved. I pressed my sticky hands into the folds of my dress, took a shaky breath, and let the tears fall where no one could see. I knew Chris would be praised for years to come, and I would be mocked in whispers and jokes. I knew the nickname would follow me to school, to family gatherings, to every corner of my childhood. But beneath the sting of humiliation, something else began to take root. Not anger, not yet, but a seed of determination buried deep, waiting for its time. Liz whispered to herself, "I won't forget this." At school, the laughter never stopped, it simply had different faces. The brick building of our suburban high school loomed each morning like a fortress I had to storm, knowing I'd emerge bruised though never visibly bleeding. The hallways echoed with sneakers slapping tile floors, lockers clanging shut, voices rising in gossip. For most, it was just noise, the ordinary chaos of adolescence. For me, it was a gauntlet, every smirk and whisper sharpened by the family name that clung to me like a curse. The Millers were respected in town. Chris, of course, carried the crown captain of the junior basketball team, honor roll darling, the boy every teacher wanted to brag about and every girl wanted to sit beside. And then there was me, the other Miller. I wore hand-me-downs from cousins who lived states away, shoes that didn't quite match in color because Mom insisted no one will notice. But everyone noticed. They noticed the fraying seams, the scuffed soles, the way my sleeves never seemed the right length. And when they noticed, they laughed. Sometimes it was loud, cruel cackling. Other times it was subtler, a glance, a snort, a whispered word that still managed to pierce deeper than a shout. Chris never stopped them. If anything, he fueled it. Walking past me in the cafeteria line, he'd pat me on the head with mock sweetness, like I was a family pet. "Careful, Liz," he'd say, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Don't drop your lunch like you dropped that cake." The reference to my 8th birthday had grown into legend, replayed in exaggerated versions until the truth no longer mattered. Laughter followed him like a shadow, and I was the punchline it fed on. Rachel Adams was the single light in that dim landscape. She wasn't popular, but she was steady, sharp-eyed, and unafraid of silence. The first time she sat with me at lunch, I expected her to leave halfway through, embarrassed to be associated with the fool. But she stayed. She stayed the next day, and the day after that, until her presence at my side became the only thing that kept me from disappearing completely. She didn't laugh when my shoes squeaked on the linoleum, or when my notebooks spilled out of my frayed backpack. Instead, she picked them up and handed them back without a word, as though to say, "You're not invisible to me." One rainy afternoon, when the cafeteria buzzed louder than usual, and Chris was basking in the attention of cheerleaders who hung on his every word, Rachel pulled out a small notebook. It was blue, the cover bent and softened by use. She flipped it open, scribbled something quickly, then slid it across the table. "We need something," she whispered, eyes bright. "Something that's ours. A promise." On the page, in her looping handwriting, were 6 words. "We won't let life break us." I read them once, twice, feeling something stir inside me that had been smothered for years. With hands that still trembled from humiliation too often repeated, I added my name beneath hers. For the first time, I felt the possibility of belonging not to my family, not to the sneering crowd, but to a friendship that didn't demand perfection or mock my failures. That notebook became our pact, our shield against the ridicule. Whenever the laughter grew too loud, Rachel would tap the spine of it, a quiet reminder that one person's faith could outweigh 100 jeers. Still, the world wasn't done crushing me. One spring morning, when the grass on the football field glittered with dew and the school was buzzing about the upcoming pep rally, Chris found his next stage. I was walking across the quad, clutching a stack of books too big for my arms, when he stepped in front of me, all smiles and casual arrogance. His friends lingered behind him, eager for the show. "Hey Liz," he called out, "tell everyone your favorite subject." Confused, I stammered something about English, shifting the books in my hands. That was all he needed. He plucked one from the pile, flipped it open, and with mock solemnity began reading a passage aloud in a ridiculous, stumbling voice. "Is that so?" he said, dragging out every syllable, crossing his eyes for effect. Laughter erupted instantly. Someone shouted, "She can't even read!" and the chorus of mockery swelled. The title I hated most was resurrected with fresh venom. "Fool! Fool!" I froze, cheeks burning, every instinct urging me to run. Rachel appeared at my side, trying to push the book back into my arms, whispering fiercely, "Ignore them, Liz. Don't let him win. But Chris's voice carried above hers, smooth and effortless. Don't worry, guys, he announced to the crowd. She's just practicing for her lifelong role. He paused for dramatic effect, then added with a smirk, the family fool. The words landed like a hammer, sealing the identity in the minds of my classmates, just as they had in my family. My books spilled onto the ground, pages fanning out in the wind. The laughter was a storm I couldn't shelter from. For a heartbeat I considered breaking down, letting the tears flow, confirming everything they believed about me. But then I saw Rachel, her jaw tight, eyes blazing with indignation. She didn't see a fool. She saw me. I bent down, gathered my books with steady hands, and lifted my chin. My voice was low, almost lost in the noise, but she heard it. She was the only one I wanted to hear it. I looked at Rachel and whispered, "One day, I'll prove them wrong." Grandfather's will became the weapon they needed to erase me completely. The mahogany-paneled law office in downtown Columbus smelled faintly of leather and dust, a place where family histories were dissected with the same cold precision as contracts. I sat at the long conference table, my palms pressed flat against the polished wood, trying not to let them see how hard my heart was pounding. Around me, the Miller clan gathered like vultures circling a carcass. Chris leaned back in his chair with a self-assured smile, already savoring the outcome he believed was his by birthright. The lawyer, Mr. Harris, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. As per the last testament of Charles Miller, he began, the estate is to be divided between his grandchildren Christopher and Elizabeth under the conditions set forth in this document. His voice carried the weight of inevitability, yet a strange tension crept in as he reached the next line. There is a clause. The inheritance shall be fully realized only upon proof of competence in managing the company assets. Failure to demonstrate capability will result in forfeiture of rights. Murmurs broke out instantly. My aunts exchanged knowing glances. An uncle chuckled under his breath. Chris didn't even bother to hide his smirk. Well, he said, gesturing toward me, that settles it, doesn't it? Liz could barely hold on to a cake at 8 years old. How could she possibly handle a corporation? His words dripped with rehearsed cruelty, echoing decades of belittlement condensed into one poisonous barb. I said nothing. Silence had always been my armor, the only shield I had when words were turned into blades against me. The relatives nodded along, eager to back the golden son. Chris has always been the capable one. Aunt Marjorie chimed in, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He's the face of this family. Elizabeth? Well, she's better suited for something simpler. The word simpler stung almost as much as the laughter from years past. I forced my face into neutrality, though my fingers curled slightly against the table. Mr. Harris shuffled papers and continued, his tone deliberately impartial. Both parties will be assessed in due course. Until then, assets remain in trust. Across the table, Chris leaned forward, his eyes burning into mine. Don't take this the wrong way, Liz. It's nothing personal. You just don't have what it takes. Grandfather knew it. We all know it. His voice lowered to a near whisper, meant for me alone but loud enough that others caught the venom. You're still the fool. A ripple of laughter circled the room, muted but unmistakable. They didn't even realize the cruelty of repeating a label that had once been a childish insult. Or maybe they did, and they enjoyed it. I kept my gaze steady, my lips pressed into a line, but deep inside a slow, burning resolve thickened. As the meeting dissolved into chatter, and congratulations directed toward Chris, I noticed a figure lingering near the door. Ethan Clark. I remembered him vaguely, once an employee at the company, dismissed abruptly during one of Chris's early power plays. He looked older now, worn at the edges, his suit fraying just enough to betray hard years. His eyes met mine briefly, and something in them held sympathy, maybe, or recognition of a shared wound. Later, as relatives swarmed around Chris in the hallway, Ethan drifted closer. His voice was low, barely above the hum of conversation. I heard the will, rough business. He paused, searching my expression. Chris has skeletons, you know. Things he'd rather keep buried. If you ever need... He let the offer hang, unfinished, before slipping away into the crowd. I stood still, replaying his words, the first crack in the fortress Chris had built around himself. My silence wasn't submission anymore. It was calculation. Let them believe I was erased. Let them believe I was too weak. That evening, the family gathered at the estate for a more informal meeting. Drinks clinked, laughter filled the room, and every sentence carried the unspoken consensus. Chris would inherit everything. He rose with theatrical confidence, addressing the circle of relatives. "Let's be clear," he declared. "Liz will be cut off. She doesn't have the brains or the grit for this. We all know where the responsibility lies." The agreement was instant, nods and murmurs of assent, as though the matter had already been settled. I sat quietly at the edge, my glass untouched, eyes fixed on the patterns in the carpet. When Chris caught my gaze, he couldn't resist twisting the knife. With a smirk, he let the familiar words slip into the room again, casual as ever, but weighted with decades of disdain. "Fool!" The syllable rang louder than the chatter, louder than the clink of glasses. My hand clenched around the stem of the untouched glass, knuckles whitening. But I didn't speak. Not yet. I let the silence hang, heavy and unbroken, while inside me the vow hardened into steel. I clenched my fist but said nothing. What they never knew was that the fool had already built an empire. The title they had tossed at me like a stone, the word that followed me through childhood classrooms and echoing family dinners, had become my shield. Behind closed doors, far away from their scornful laughter, I had been working, brick by brick, to create something none of them could touch. Now, in the glass-walled boardroom of Miller Dynamics, I sat at the head of the table, my table, and listened as my directors addressed me with the formality my family never had. "Madam CEO," one of them said, sliding a binder across the polished surface. The word CEO still felt like a blade slicing through years of humiliation. I nodded, my expression calm, but inside a storm of vindication raged. No one outside this room, no aunt, no uncle, certainly not Chris, had any idea that the girl they had branded as the fool had risen to command a company whose contracts touched Washington itself. Rachel sat just behind my right shoulder, taking notes with her steady, methodical hand. She had been my anchor since high school, the only one who saw beyond the laughter, and now she was my confidant, my assistant, my proof that loyalty could exist in a world full of betrayal. When I glanced back at her, her eyes met mine briefly, filled with the quiet encouragement that had carried me this far. The screen at the end of the boardroom lit up with the face of Robert Carter. His voice carried the clipped authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes deals. "Congratulations, Miss Miller," he said, his tone respectful, even deferential. "Securing the federal contract wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. You've outmaneuvered some of the most powerful competitors in the industry. Washington is impressed." Around the table, directors shifted, murmurs of approval swelling like a low tide. I allowed myself a small nod, never letting my composure slip. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Discretion is as important as the deal itself. We'll keep everything sealed until the holiday." Carter's lips curved in a half-smile. "Secrecy is understood. But when the news breaks, it will redefine your company and your legacy. The Miller name is about to stand for something more than privilege." The connection cut, leaving only the faint reflection of my own face on the screen. Rachel leaned closer, her voice lowered but firm. "Liz, Thanksgiving is going to be brutal. You know how they are. Chris won't suspect a thing, but once this contract becomes public, they'll realize you've already won. You need to decide if you want to drop the news there or wait." I tapped my fingers against the table, a slow rhythm matching the thoughts running through my head. Timing was everything. Revenge wasn't about fury, it was about precision. "Not yet," I murmured. "They won't hear it until I want them to, until the right moment." The boardroom settled into silence as the contract was placed before me. A stack of papers, heavy not with their weight, but with their meaning. This was no ordinary agreement. It was the culmination of years of silence, of biting my tongue, of letting them believe their insult was true. My pen hovered briefly before meeting the page, the ink flowing as steady as the promise I had made to myself long ago. With each signature, I sealed the future in my favor. Rachel let out a breath that sounded like relief and warning all at once. "It's done," she whispered. I sat back, the echo of the pen still alive in my hand. The empire they never believed I could build was now undeniable, though they remained oblivious. Let them laugh one more time. Let them toast Chris as the heir apparent. When the curtain rose, the truth would hit harder than any insult. The hum of the projector dimmed, replaced by the soft ping of my computer. An email notification glowed on the corner of the screen. I clicked it open, scanning the subject line, and felt the corner of my mouth curl upward. Dinner invitation, Thanksgiving 2023. Under the glow of chandeliers, I became their entertainment again. The dining hall at the Miller estate sparkled with polished silver and glass, the kind of ostentation my family adored, but for me it was nothing more than a stage. Thanksgiving night always felt like a ritual of subtle cruelty, one where I knew the script before a word was spoken. Still, I walked in with my head high, Rachel close behind me, her presence a quiet reassurance as I took my seat at the long mahogany table. The room was filled with the noise of polished laughter and clinking glasses, conversations about promotions, market shifts, and vacations abroad. Chris dominated the table, as he always had, his voice louder than the rest, his charm rehearsed for the benefit of relatives who had chosen their favorite child years ago. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin carved into his face, raising his glass. "Another year, another success," he announced. "Carter's firm has been nothing short of extraordinary. Promotions, bonuses, our name carries weight in every boardroom now." The applause that followed was immediate, the kind of reflexive admiration I had grown used to watching from the shadows. I sat quietly in my modest navy dress, the kind chosen not to dazzle, but to function. It was simple, elegant in its own way, but in this room, simplicity was seen as poverty. A cousin glanced my way and chuckled. "Liz, you look like you borrowed that from a thrift shop." The laughter spread, contagious and cruel, spilling across the table like wine. "Don't be so harsh," another relative chimed in, feigning sympathy with a smile. "It's just Liz. She's always been different." The word hung there, heavy with its real meaning. Different meant lesser, different meant expendable. And then, predictably, it came. An uncle leaned forward, his voice rich with the smugness of a man who thought cruelty was wit. "Ah, the fool graces us again." The room erupted, forks clinking against plates as the insult became a chorus. Laughter rolled over me, wave after wave, and I sat perfectly still. Inside, my fists clenched under the table, nails biting into my palms, but outwardly I smiled faintly, as if their words no longer carried weight. Chris seized the moment, raising his glass once more. "To family," he declared, pausing with calculated drama. His eyes flicked toward me, and his grin widened. "And to the family's greatest failure, may she always remind us how far the Millers can fall." The table roared with approval, the sound echoing in my ears until it felt deafening. I let my gaze drift over the glittering chandeliers, the flicker of candlelight bouncing across polished crystal, and for a fleeting second, I was 8 years old again, standing in the middle of this same room, with cake on the floor and tears burning in my eyes. The cycle was complete. They had taken their pleasure, once more reducing me to a caricature they could laugh at. But then the vibration against the wood cut through everything. My phone buzzed on the table, screen lighting up in the dimmed glow. The name pulsed across the glass. Assistant Carter. The timing was divine, surgical. Every insult, every laugh, every mocking toast had led to this moment. The chatter dulled as eyes flicked toward the sound, curiosity stirring in the room. I reached for the phone with deliberate calm, sliding it toward me, letting them all see the name on the screen. I looked up slowly, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of my lips. "Excuse me," I said softly, pushing my chair back. "I should take this." The louder they laughed, the sharper the knives cut. Their voices rose in waves around the long dining table, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany as though the room itself reveled in my humiliation. Chris commanded the spotlight as easily as breathing, spinning story after story of his so-called triumphs at Carter's firm. Each word was polished, rehearsed, crafted to draw out admiration, and he basked in it like a king. He didn't just entertain the family, he fed them, the version of reality he wanted them to believe. And they devoured it without hesitation. I sat near the far end, my plate untouched, my posture measured. Every so often, Rachel's eyes flickered toward me, her expression calm, reassuring. But she stayed silent, a shadow in my corner, her loyalty unspoken but unyielding. Chris leaned forward, glass in hand, his grin stretching. "It isn't just about money," he said. "It's about influence. Carter trusts me with clients worth billions, and the respect that comes with that you can't buy it." Applause rippled across the table. My parents beamed, pride swelling in their faces, as though his success were the family's crowning jewel. Then the tide turned toward me. A cousin, smirking over a fork of turkey, tilted her head. "Liz, you've been so quiet tonight. Don't you have anything to share? Or is there nothing worth mentioning?" The remark was delivered with feigned sweetness, but the smirk betrayed the sting behind it. Before I could answer, another voice chimed in sharper. "At least Chris makes us proud. Liz, what do you make?" The table erupted in a ripple of chuckles, the laughter slicing through me. I lowered my gaze, keeping my face neutral, though I felt the heat burn in my chest. Maybe she makes excuses, one uncle offered, sending another burst of laughter rolling down the table. I gripped my napkin under the table, my fingers pressing so hard that the fabric twisted into knots. I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes, waiting for me to break, to stammer out some pathetic defense. Instead, I let silence speak. I let them believe I was small. Silence was its own kind of blade, and mine was sharper than they knew. Chris lifted his glass again, drawing all attention back to himself, the self-appointed star of every story. "You know," he said, his voice carrying with a practiced authority, "there's a reason I'm the one Carter trusts. There's a reason I'll always sit at the real tables of power." Liz, his eyes met mine, that cruel smile curving. "You? You'll never sit at a real table of power. Not in this lifetime." The words hit harder than the laughter, a final brand meant to burn into the room's memory. Applause followed, hollow and sharp, affirming his cruelty. I lifted my eyes slowly, not to answer but to remind myself of the moment. My expression remained unreadable, my silence unbroken. Instead, I shifted slightly in my chair, let my hand slide casually to the watch at my wrist. Its face glowed faintly in the light. The time was nearly there. I glanced at it once, then looked back up with a faint smile, letting my gaze sweep across the table. It was almost time. Sometimes victory arrives in the form of a single phone call. The words of Chris's toast still lingered in the air, heavy with cruelty and applause, when the vibration in my pocket cut through the noise. It was faint at first, an almost imperceptible hum, but in that silence between one round of laughter and the next, it became deafening to me. I let the moment hang, my hand poised above my fork as though nothing had happened. Then I slid the phone out, its screen glowing in the chandelier's reflection. Assistant Carter. The room fell quiet with curiosity. "Really, Liz?" my aunt scoffed. "We're at dinner." I smiled faintly. "Yes, we are." Without another word, I set the phone on the polished table and tapped speaker. The room, still buzzing with arrogance, wasn't prepared for what followed. "Congratulations, CEO Miller." Carter's voice rang out, crisp and professional, carrying across the table like a judge's gavel. "The federal contract is officially secured. Washington approved all terms this evening. We're ready to roll first thing tomorrow." The words slammed into the hall with a weight none of them could deflect. A fork clattered to the floor. Chris froze, his glass halfway to his lips, the smirk evaporating as if wiped clean. His hand shook, and in the stillness, his glasses slipped from his fingers and struck the table with a sharp crack, lenses bouncing before skittering across the linen. The air thickened. My parents blinked rapidly, their mouths parting without words. Relatives glanced from me to Chris, their faces caught between disbelief and shame. For years they had dressed me in the costume of their fool now, the mask shattered with a single sentence. Rachel's eyes found mine from across the table, steady and calm. She didn't need to speak. Her pride radiated silently, an anchor in the storm. I leaned forward, close enough for the microphone to capture my voice clearly. "Thank you," I said, tone even, deliberate, each syllable landing like a stone. "I'll see you at the office tomorrow." The call ended with a soft click. No laughter followed. No one dared breathe too loudly. I lifted my fork again, carved a small bite from the untouched turkey on my plate, and resumed eating as though nothing had happened. The silence around me grew heavier with each motion, the stares burning, the reality settling in. They had mocked me as the fool. Now they sat paralyzed, unsure how to speak to the woman who had become CEO. I chewed slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch until it belonged entirely to me. Then I set down my fork, folded my napkin, and without raising my eyes, I allowed the silence to stand. The family stared. When the laughter died, shame rushed in to replace it. The dining hall, once a stage for jeers and arrogance, was now steeped in a suffocating quiet. The chandeliers above cast the same golden light, but it seemed colder, harsher, reflecting off faces that no longer dared to meet mine. Forks and knives lay still. The sound of clinking glasses had evaporated as though it had never existed. For the first time in years, I was not their fool. I was their mirror. An uncle cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the silence. He reached for his wine, swirling it nervously. "Well," he muttered with a forced smile, "I suppose. I always knew Liz had some spark in her. Just didn't expect it to be this big, eh? The words landed limp, an apology masquerading as admiration, but the insincerity clung to every syllable. Another relative leaned forward, her tone suddenly saccharine. You must tell us more, dear. A federal contract. Such a responsibility. We're all so proud. The smile trembled on her lips, fragile as glass. I did not answer. Silence became my ally. I let them fumble with their words, let them stew in the discomfort of their own hypocrisy. Every attempt at small talk dissolved, like pebbles cast into a bottomless well. Chris, red creeping into his cheeks, broke the standoff. This is ridiculous, he snapped, the edge in his voice sharper than he intended. Some assistant making a mistake? A mix-up, that's all. She can't be. His hands clenched the tablecloth, knuckles pale. He had always believed power belonged to him by default. For him to imagine me holding it was unthinkable. Rachel's gaze flicked to me, quiet strength in her eyes, but she said nothing. She understood what I was doing. Every second I remained calm, every moment I let their words collapse under their own weight, was another blade turned against them. Finally, my father spoke. His voice was low, hesitant, the certainty he once wielded gone. Liz, he swallowed, his eyes darting nervously toward Chris before finding mine. Is this true? The room seemed to lean in, holding its breath. My mother shifted in her seat, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. My father's eyes, usually so stern, were searching now, pleading for some version of the daughter he thought he knew. I met his gaze without flinching. My voice was soft, but it cut through the room like steel. What do you think? The question hung there, heavier than any declaration I could have made. He faltered, his mouth opening, then closing again. No answer came. There was nothing left to say. Beneath the table, Rachel's hand found mine. She squeezed, a silent reassurance, a reminder that I was not alone in this. And in that quiet gesture, I felt the power shift fully into my hands. It wasn't just dinner, they were planning my erasure from the family legacy. The chandeliers in the dining hall still glowed, but the warmth of the banquet had soured into something tense, calculated. Plates lay half-eaten, the turkey's sheen dulled by silence. When the family lawyer entered the adjoining side room and gestured for us to follow, the gathering shifted from mockery to tribunal. The laughter from earlier now felt like a distant echo. We gathered in the smaller chamber, its mahogany walls lined with ancestral portraits, stern eyes staring down at us as if judging. Chris walked in first, shoulders squared, arrogance twitching beneath the cracks of his composure. My parents flanked him, faces tight. Relatives settled uneasily, whispering fragments that carried the sting of doubt. I took my place at the end of the table, Rachel a silent presence just behind me. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, placing a thick folder on the table. His voice was neutral, but every word struck with precision. As you are all aware, the late Mr. Miller's will contained a performance clause regarding succession of the estate. Managerial competence, demonstrated through measurable results, is the determining factor. Chris leaned forward eagerly, his smirk returning. Then the matter is clear. I've been the one carrying the Miller name in business, in society, for years. Everyone here knows that. Murmurs of agreement fluttered around the room. Old habits die hard. They were accustomed to believing Chris's narrative. The lawyer did not flinch. Yet, he said slowly, opening the folder, tonight brought forth new evidence. The federal contract awarded to Miller Dynamics under Elizabeth Miller's leadership. This constitutes significant proof of competence. The air shifted. Faces that had just been nodding now wavered. My mother's hand froze mid-motion, her pearls clicking faintly. Chris's composure shattered. He slammed a fist on the table. She stole this. You think she did this herself? Number she manipulated. She tricked someone, Carter, into giving her credit. This is fraud. I didn't move. I didn't need to. My silence was more cutting than rebuttal. From the back of the room, a voice rose low, deliberate. Ethan Clark. His presence, until now unnoticed by most, suddenly weighed heavily. He stepped forward slightly, eyes fixed on me, but loud enough for Chris to hear every word. I know what he's done, Ethan said softly, and I can help expose it. Chris's head whipped toward him, color draining from his face. For a fraction of a second, fear broke through the bravado. Then he recovered with a sneer. You? A disgruntled ex-employee? Pathetic. But Ethan didn't waver, and neither did I. His signal was enough. The balance of power was tilting. The lawyer cleared his throat again, adjusting his papers. Given the present evidence, Elizabeth Miller currently holds the stronger claim under the will's conditions. Unless substantial counterproof is provided, her position supersedes Christopher's. End quote. The verdict fell like a gavel. A sharp crack of inevitability echoed in Chris's mind, if not in sound. His chair screeched back violently as he stood. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice breaking into rage. He pointed at me, finger trembling not from anger alone, but from the dawning recognition of his defeat. "You think this changes anything? I'll destroy you for this." And with that, he stormed out, the door slamming so hard the portraits on the wall rattled, vowing revenge. Thanksgiving ended not with unity, but with fractures splitting the family apart. The Miller estate's grand living room still smelled faintly of roasted turkey and spiced cider, but the warmth of the holiday had been poisoned. The polished mahogany furniture reflected fractured light from the fireplace, as though even the room itself could not reconcile what had just happened. Family members gathered in uneasy clusters, whispering, their voices sharp with judgment or soft with uncertainty. I sat quietly near the far window, the frost from the late November night glazing the glass. Behind me, the relatives divided themselves into camps. One uncle, cheeks flushed with wine, approached with a hesitant smile. "Liz," he said, stumbling over my name as if it were foreign to his tongue. "Perhaps I judged too quickly. The family should stick together, especially now. You understand, don't you?" His words carried desperation more than sincerity, the faint scent of opportunism clinging to each syllable. An aunt was less subtle, her eyes narrow. "Don't think this makes you one of us. Titles and contracts don't erase years of failure. Chris was meant to lead. Everyone knows that." Her bitterness dripped into the room like acid, corroding the fragile truce her brother had tried to build. My mother's voice cut through them all, cool and unwavering. "Elizabeth may have stumbled her way into something, but Christopher has always been the true heir of this family. He has dignity, vision, charm. Her eyes flicked to me, cold as winter glass. She will always be the fool, no matter what title she borrows." Rachel stiffened at my side, but I lifted a hand to stop her from speaking. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and turned my back to my mother without a word. Silence was my armor, my sharpest blade. No rebuttal, no plea. The power of not engaging tightened around the room like a vice. For the first time, they were forced to sit with their own words, unanswered, unchallenged. As I moved toward the door, Rachel leaned close enough for only me to hear. "They're afraid of you now. That's your strength." The quiet conviction in her whisper anchored me, steadied the fury that simmered under my composure. Outside the window, a shadow lingered at the edge of the veranda. Chris stood there, his face twisted with barely contained rage, the light of the fire casting a red gleam across his features. His fists were clenched at his sides, breath fogging in the cold night air. He had overheard every word, his humiliation fermenting into something darker. When the last murmur inside faded, his voice slithered into the night, low and venomous. "This isn't over." And I knew then that his retaliation had already begun to take shape. Defeat did not humble him, it only sharpened his cruelty. Chris's office at Carter's firm was a fortress of ambition dressed in steel and glass. The skyline of Columbus glittered through the wide windows, but inside the room the air was thick with menace. It was early December, the city preparing for Christmas lights and festivity. Yet here, beneath the veneer of order, malice brewed. Chris leaned over his desk, papers spread before him, the glow of his monitor casting a harsh pallor across his face. The memory of Thanksgiving still haunted him, the stunned silence after Carter's assistant's call, the looks of betrayal on the relatives' faces, the cold certainty that Liz had taken what he believed was rightfully his. That humiliation festered into a need, one that eclipsed reason. Tonight, he would begin his counterstrike. A man in a rumpled suit sat across from him, shifting uncomfortably. "Are you sure about this, Chris? Forging documents tied to a federal contract. This isn't small potatoes." Chris smirked, sliding a check across the desk. "Small potatoes? No, my friend. This is strategy. Liz thinks she's clever. She thinks silence and timing make her untouchable. But one rumor, one shred of proof that she falsified numbers, and her empire crumbles. People don't care about truth. They care about headlines." The man picked up the check, his hesitation dissolving into greed. Chris pushed a folder toward him. "You'll testify if necessary." That you saw her alter documents, that she cut corners to land Carter's deal. It doesn't have to be airtight, just loud enough to echo. Outside the office, the city's lights twinkled like conspiratorial stars. Inside, another figure entered, a cousin from the family, one who had always hovered near Chris's orbit. The cousin's eyes darted nervously. You promise this will fix everything, right? That the inheritance will swing back to you? Chris clasped him on the shoulder, his smile slick and rehearsed. All you have to do is confirm my story when the lawyer asks. You've always believed I was the rightful heir. Tonight, you prove it. The cousin nodded weakly, already ensnared. But Chris wasn't finished. He summoned another pawn, a disgruntled former employee of Miller Dynamics. The man's bitterness was palpable, his resentment spilling into every word. Chris dangled promises of money and revenge, painting Liz as the shared enemy. Testify that she mistreated you, that she manipulated numbers, that she made deals she couldn't back. You want payback? Here's your chance. The man hesitated, then nodded grimly. The contract was sealed, not with signatures, but with desperation and spite. Chris leaned back in his chair, surveying the room like a general admiring his arsenal. Tomorrow, he declared, his voice dripping with triumph, she'll be exposed as the real fool. He gathered the paper's falsified spreadsheets, doctored emails, fabricated timelines, and placed them neatly into a black dossier. The weight of it was both physical and symbolic, the culmination of his venom disguised as truth. He slid it into his leather briefcase with a finality that made his allies shift uneasily. What Chris didn't notice was the faint click of a camera from across the street. Ethan Clark, parked in the shadows of a nondescript sedan, lifted his lens and captured the meeting through the office's glass facade. His fingers steady, his patience unyielding, Ethan snapped frame after frame. Chris exchanging bribes, Chris handing over falsified documents, Chris boasting of tomorrow's spectacle. The proof that Chris thought buried in lies was already unraveling, one shutter click at a time. And as Chris snapped his briefcase shut, convinced of his coming victory, Ethan lowered the camera and whispered into the cold December night, "Got you. Rumors travel faster than the truth, and this time they carry my name." The corridors of Miller Dynamics hummed with a new, uneasy energy. It wasn't the usual Monday morning buzz of deadlines or the muted chatter of analysts trading weekend stories. No, this was different. Whispers clung to the walls like shadows. Eyes darted away when I passed. Voices dropped mid-sentence, and yet the words ugly, damning words, still reached me. Fraud, lies, manipulation. I walked straight-backed, my heels striking the polished floor with a steadiness I didn't entirely feel. Rachel kept pace beside me, her notebook clutched tightly, eyes flashing with both fury and fear. "They're saying the contract numbers were falsified," she hissed under her breath, barely containing herself. "That you doctored files. Chris is behind this, I know it. You can't just let it spread." Her voice was urgent, insistent, and it tore at the composure I wore like armor. But I couldn't afford to lash out. Not yet. "If I defend myself now," I said quietly, "it'll sound like desperation. Chris wants me rattled. He wants me loud." Rachel's face hardened. "And what if silence gives him the stage?" Before I could answer, a pair of junior analysts passed us, their voices sharp as needles. "I heard the feds will pull the contract," one murmured. "Carter will cut ties. She'll take the fall." They glanced at me then, flinched when our eyes met, and scurried off as if I carried contagion. I inhaled slowly, forcing air into my lungs. The smear campaign was spreading perfectly. Too perfectly. Chris had orchestrated this with precision. Seed the whispers, let suspicion grow like mold in the dark. Soon, even allies would question my competence. At the end of the hall, leaning against the glass wall of an unused office, Ethan Clark waited. His presence was deliberate, patient. His gaze found mine, steady and almost reassuring, as if he'd been expecting me. Rachel noticed him too and bristled. "What is he doing here?" "Maybe something we need," I murmured, and broke stride toward him. Inside the dim office, the hum of the building faded. Ethan closed the door behind us and wasted no time. "Chris is playing his hand," he said, in a low, controlled voice. He placed a small envelope on the desk between us. "I've been watching him, photographing him, every bribe, every forgery documented." Rachel leaned forward, suspicion mingling with hope. "And you're just giving this to us? Why?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I know what it's like to be crushed by him. He ruined me once. I'm not going to let him do it again. Besides," he added, glancing at me, You're the only one in this family who fights with silence instead of poison. I slid the envelope closer, my fingers brushing the crisp edges. Proof. Not just whispers, not just suspicions, something solid to hold against Chris's lies. For the first time that morning, the ice in my chest thawed just enough to let resolve flow in. I can't let him dictate the narrative, I said at last. My reflection in the glass pane was calm, but my voice carried the steel of decision. If Chris wants a spectacle, then we'll give him one, but on my terms. Rachel's eyes widened. You mean? Yes, I cut in, decisive. An emergency board meeting, tonight, with Carter present. Let Chris bring his little performance. We'll answer with truth. The decision sent a ripple of both dread and determination through me. A board meeting wasn't just internal, it was a stage, a battlefield. Carter's presence would mean everything. Credibility, oversight, the judgment that could solidify my empire or raze it to dust. Rachel straightened, her notebook forgotten. Then we prepare. We'll hold steady until then. But Ethan didn't look reassured. He tilted his head, studying me with something between admiration and concern. Chris won't come quietly. He'll play dirty until the end. I know, I said simply, and that's why we'll end it. Hours later, as twilight pressed its weight against the skyscraper windows, I stood at the threshold of the boardroom. The air inside was thick with unease. Directors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, whispers threading between them like invisible wires. Rachel sat near me, her hand poised on the table, ready to steady mine if needed. Ethan, unseen in the back, clutched his proof like a weapon waiting to be drawn. And then the doors opened. Chris walked in, suit immaculate, smirk sharpened like a blade. In his hand, gleaming under the recessed lights, was a thick dossier, the same one he had pieced together with lies and bribes. He laid it on the table with a flourish, his eyes meeting mine with the confidence of a man convinced he already owned the ending. I didn't move, didn't flinch. The storm he brought with him was about to break, and I was ready to let it. Because tomorrow belonged to truth. For years they called me fool. Today, I let the truth speak. The boardroom glowed with sterile light, its long table gleaming like a stage where reputations were tried and executed. Outside, the December wind scraped against the glass, as though the city itself held its breath. Around me, directors murmured, papers shuffled, and Carter sat at the head of the table with a look carved from stone. His presence turned the meeting from routine into trial. Chris stood tall, dossier in hand, the performance of his life already underway. He opened the folder and spread out documents with exaggerated care, each page a knife he believed would gut me. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice confident, oiled with arrogance. We cannot ignore what's been uncovered. This contract, our so-called federal triumph, is a sham. Elizabeth manipulated the numbers, falsified documents, and presented a fraud. She's unfit to sit at this table. The words slid into the room like venom. Several directors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from me to Carter. Chris thrived on their discomfort, flashing the smirk he had worn since childhood, the one that once made me shrink. Carter leaned forward, fingers steepled, gaze cold. Elizabeth, he said, his tone measured, are these allegations true? Silence pressed down like lead. Rachel's hand hovered near mine under the table, steadying me without touch. Ethan waited in the back, tense, his evidence hidden in the shadows like a dagger waiting for its moment. I breathed once, twice. Number. My voice was calm, deliberate. And I will show you why. Chris barked a laugh. You'll deny until the end, won't you? Just like always, slinking in silence while the adults handle the real world. He shoved the forged documents closer to Carter. Here's the proof. But his triumph lasted only seconds. I slid a thin folder across the polished surface, my own evidence. Here are authenticated copies of the federal contract, I said evenly, stamped and filed by the Department of Defense. Each page carries government timestamps, signatures, and audit trails, untouchable. The directors leaned forward, eyes narrowing as they examined the papers. Carter's brows furrowed, his skepticism pricked but not yet undone. I continued, my voice steady. And here are the communications between my office and the contracting agency. Every exchange logged, encrypted, and verified. I placed the second folder atop the first, compare them with his. A murmur rippled through the room. Chris's confidence wavered. Then Ethan stepped forward, quiet but resolute. He placed a series of photographs on the table, each one capturing Chris in shadowed meetings with his co-conspirators bribing a relative, slipping an envelope to a former employee, hunched over falsified spreadsheets. Ethan's voice was low but firm. I watched him forge these documents. I recorded every step. He didn't plan to win honestly, he planned to bury her. Gasps filled the boardroom. The directors' faces shifted disgust, disbelief, dawning realization. Chris's hands trembled as he snatched at the photographs, his words stumbling. Lies, fabrications, he's nothing but… I cut him off, my voice slicing clean through the chaos. A fool cannot sign a federal contract, but a CEO can. The words hung in the air like a verdict. They carried the weight of decades, the laughter, the mockery, the name that had been branded into me like a scar. And now, turned on its head, it became my weapon. Chris froze, the blood draining from his face. The directors exchanged glances, one by one nodding. When Carter finally spoke, his voice was grave and final. The evidence is clear. The board votes, he glanced around the table, unanimously in Elizabeth Miller's favor. The gavel of silence struck the room. Chris swayed slightly, his jaw slack, his face leached of all color. The victory was mine, but the war was not yet over. And in his hollow eyes, I saw the shape of the next battle forming. When masks fall, even the proudest stand naked in shame. The marble lobby of Carter's firm had once been Chris's kingdom, a stage on which he paraded his spotless suits, his easy charm, his carefully rehearsed stories of triumph. But now, every echo of his shoes against the polished floor was swallowed by silence. Colleagues who once rushed to greet him with eager smiles looked away as he passed. Some busied themselves with papers that didn't need sorting. Others vanished into offices, their doors clicking shut in deliberate retreat. Chris kept his head high, but his jaw was tight, the skin pale beneath the overhead lights. He pushed open the door to Carter's office, expecting some remnant of the respect he once commanded. Instead, Carter sat behind his desk like a judge awaiting the condemned. His tone was sharp, stripped of the camaraderie he used to feign. "You've left me no choice," Carter said, sliding a file across the desk. Inside, Chris saw the words, "Reassignment, demotion." The board cannot afford even a shadow of scandal. Your brother's, or rather, your sister's victory, was secured legally, and your attempts to fabricate otherwise. He paused, shaking his head with cold finality. You are a liability. Effective immediately, you will step down from all client-facing responsibilities. Consider this. Generous. The word stung worse than the punishment. Generous. As if Carter had spared him out of pity, not merit. Chris swallowed hard. I've given this firm everything. You think she… Enough! Carter's interruption cut like steel. This conversation is over. Chris staggered from the office, dossier still in hand, though now it felt like a death sentence. Outside, colleagues lingered in the hallway, their voices lowered to poisonous whispers. He caught fragments as he passed. Fraud, desperate, finished. Faces turned away, backs stiffened. A few smirked openly, no longer afraid of the man who had fallen from grace. The Miller relatives who had once basked in his glow were no kinder. In the days that followed, the estate halls that had echoed with their applause now buzzed with whispers of betrayal and mockery. Uncles who had toasted him at Thanksgiving now muttered that they'd always known Liz had the sharper mind. Aunts who once preened at his successes sniffed coldly when his name was spoken, switching allegiance without shame. At home, Chris poured whiskey into a glass that trembled in his hand. His reflection stared back from the darkened window, thinner, gaunter, stripped of the golden aura he had worked so hard to polish. His lips moved around words that had never before left him, heavy with an honesty that scorched. Maybe I was the fool all along. The admission slipped into the empty room like a confession to no one and nothing. For the first time, Chris felt the weight of failure not as an obstacle to be crushed, but as a truth too vast to deny. Yet outside, the world moved on. Newspapers rolled off presses, websites blazed with headlines, and television anchors smiled into cameras as the story spread. CEO Liz Miller secures historic federal deal. The image of my triumph stared back from every screen, every page, while Chris sat in silence, the applause of the world now belonging to me and the ruins of his pride belonging to him alone. Justice does not rush, it arrives when it must. Snow drifted in slow spirals outside my apartment balcony, the kind of quiet Christmas Eve snowfall that blanketed the city in silver light. From 20 stories up, the streets looked peaceful. Strings of holiday bulbs weaving through trees, neon signs glowing in the frosted windows of shops that had stayed open late. The city, my city, pulsed with life beneath me, and for the first time in years, I felt no trace of the gnawing hunger to belong at the Miller estate. Rachel stepped out beside me, wrapping her coat tighter against the chill. She carried with her a small object, an old, battered notebook, edges frayed from years of handling. She set it on the balcony ledge between us, and smiled with a tenderness that went beyond words. "Do you remember?" she asked, brushing the cover with her glove. "We wrote our dream pact here. Back then, you swore one day you'd prove them wrong." I stared at the familiar scrawl of ink across the front, memories flickering like ghosts, the sound of classmates laughing, Chris's voice branding me fool, the sting of family indifference. I let the silence stretch, then spoke softly, my breath fogging the air. I thought I needed their approval. I thought the only way to erase their laughter was to prove myself to them. But now, I turned to Rachel, the faintest smile touching my lips. I didn't need to prove anything, I only needed to survive myself. Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment she looked like the girl who once sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor, whispering promises that neither of us fully believed we'd keep. "And you did," she whispered back. "You more than did." My phone buzzed on the railing, interrupting the quiet. I picked it up, saw an unfamiliar number, and hesitated. When I answered, the voice on the other end was warm, professional, almost reverent. "Miss Miller, we'd like to invite you to keynote at the Global Leadership Summit in January. Your journey from adversity to triumph is exactly the inspiration the world needs." I thanked them calmly, though my heart beat against my ribs with a force that almost startled me. When I ended the call, Rachel arched an eyebrow knowingly. "See? It was never about them. It was about the world seeing you as you are." I lifted the notebook again, flipping it open to the page where two girls had once scribbled in childish handwriting. "We won't let life break us." Across the page, another word stared at me in faded ink, "fool." With deliberate care, I drew a firm line through it and wrote a single word beneath, in bold, steady letters. CEO. Closing the notebook, I set it gently aside, as though finally laying to rest a ghost that had haunted me since childhood. Then I leaned against the balcony rail, letting the icy wind sting my cheeks, and gazed out over the city. The skyline shimmered with 1,000 points of light, each one a reminder that I had carved my own place in this world, not borrowed, not begged for, but earned in silence, in struggle, in relentless defiance. Rachel stood beside me without speaking, her presence enough. The city breathed, and I breathed with it, shoulders lighter than they had ever been. Somewhere below, bells rang faintly from a cathedral, their sound carried upward on the cold December air. I whispered to no one and everyone at once, "The story isn't over." The city lights glimmered in my eyes like constellations, and I knew the truth. Justice may come late, but it always comes. And for the first time, the future stretched before me, not as a battlefield, but as an open road waiting to be claimed. Beneath the glow of the city lights, the long arc of betrayal finally bent toward justice, and the one once branded a fool stood tall as a victor. Chris's downfall served as a reminder that deceit may rise quickly, but it always collapses under its own weight. When injustice is met with courage and persistence, the truth does not just restore dignity, it reshapes destiny itself. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If you felt empowered by this journey, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you resonate with Liz's triumph, or 2 if you think the ending left you wanting more.